Hello again, and welcome back to Don't Worry About the Government, or at least the video adjunct to Don't Worry About the Government. For the full podcast, go and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. If you want the video versions of the show, they are available if you become a supporting member over at patreon.com/DWATG. Buck a show is all we ask, like Dan Carlin. Sub up and you will get the full video versions of Don't Worry About the Government. On the next Don't Worry About the Government, I'll be doing a full breakdown of all of the election numbers, but right now we don't have those available to us. We only have partial election results, but that actually brings us to a very important topic that I want to begin with. I don't know who needs to hear this. Actually, in some cases, I know exactly who needs to hear this. But it is political malpractice, especially if you have an audience that follows you, to make sweeping pronouncements about the state of American electoral affairs with only partial election results. This is something that for years we've harangued Fox News for doing, but it seems that it's no longer exclusive to the right of center anymore. It is political malpractice to be making sweeping pronouncements, especially around, let's say, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on election night, when, especially if you're in news and commentary, you've been reading articles and headlines and seeing statements from politicians, up to and including Bernie Sanders, saying to expect the vote counting process to take multiple days and certainly multiple hours, and that it would not be instantaneous, and that the disparity between the in-person voting totals and the mail-in ballot totals were going to create a bit of a red mirage. It is amazing how many people who are trying to monetize their knowledge about politics in America were able to get away with this version of commentary malpractice last night. And it's extremely disheartening to see how that has ripple effects through their audience, because America is so much driven by a politics of people as heuristics, which is to say, we look to voices that we trust to get information and base our opinions off of it. Are you immune to this, Chris? No, absolutely not. We'll talk about the polling here in a bit. I think polling's a really good example of people as heuristics, and a lot of us looked at the polling thus far, and it seems as though you can't really trust it. And I think there's going to be real skepticism going into 2022 and 2024 surrounding polling. And I don't think it's going to be just exclusive to the Republican Party anymore. I think you're going to see a much broader skepticism about the polls and whether or not you can really trust them. But first and foremost, let me just ask, I hope that you're not still up. You got some sleep, right? Did you get some sleep? Because I'm having coffee right now. It's early. Well, I mean, it's 9:30 right now here. But hopefully you got some sleep. You shouldn't stay up through election night and white knuckle through this stuff. Breathe. Take it easy. Relax, all right? Mellow. Let's get into my thoughts about election night. And if I was going to do the politically irresponsible thing, if election commentary, especially on election night, was just about finding a way to weasel partial results into affirming my worldview, I would sandwich in a few things like this. Maybe Joe Biden was running a little too vaguely and running on stuff like Build Back Better, whereas Americans need to hear things more like, I have a plan for that. So, Build Back Better, not me, us, little touchy-feely, little squishy, little I want to give you a hug. I have a plan for that. It's a tangible thing. America voted for the guy who had a plan to build a wall. It was stupid, but people liked the idea of this concrete plan, or this plan of concrete, as it were. Maybe that's the issue. And if it was just about affirming my worldview, I'd find a way to sandwich that in. If it was just about affirming my worldview, I would suggest that maybe the Democrats ought to have a signature deliverable policy that polled well nationwide. And if it was just about affirming my worldview, I'd point to the election results in Arizona in Montana when it came to marijuana legalization and posit that maybe the argument that marijuana legalization is a political loser is bunk. And if anything, we see time and again in red states, it's a wedge issue that pulls favorably for the Democrats. And the Democratic Party would do really, really well to full and open-heartedly embrace marijuana legalization. And if Harris and Biden can learn anything as an administration, they would be wise to embrace and advance the process of marijuana legalization. And then the Democratic Party would be wise to get a bunch of ballot measures on key states that they'd like to win. Like, for example, if you were trying to win Texas in 2024, a great thing to kind of close up that 5-point gap that you see that still lingers. Positive movement in Texas, 16% in 2012, 9% in 2016, 5% in 2020. If I wanted to close that 5% gap, you got Ted Cruz on the ballot next time. And if you had marijuana legalization in the state of Texas next time and a real activist base behind that, maybe, just maybe, you get the Democrats over the hump in the state of Texas. And it certainly seems like there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's a thing that the Democrats have available to them that they have heretofore been avoiding, and telling people you're going to send them to mandatory marijuana rehab on their dime and calling that progress. Maybe you can do a little bit better than that. Maybe. Again, if it was just about affirming my worldview, if it's not about waiting to get the full electoral results here, although you have enough here to back that one up. If it was just about affirming my worldview, I would say something like Americans repeatedly say that their number one issue is the economy, and that the Republicans, for their fault, have a bogus but known theory of economics. What is the Republican/conservative theory of economics? Supply side, right? Yeah, you know it. And we know it so well that we even know like pejorative mocking framings of supply side, where I take all your money and then it trickles down off of my leg onto your head and you get a little bit of it back. Like, we have a whole understanding of that economic theory of growth. What do the Democrats and the left and the liberals have? I mean, even if you want to be like modern monetary theory, okay, do you really understand it? Do people really understand it anywhere near the level of saturation of supply side economics, or even the Green New Deal? And to this point, the Democrats, the leadership, the establishment wing of the party is actually a little bit further behind the progressive wing of the party here. So the Green New Deal is like a broad, vague catch-all, and it's hard to actually understand what the theory of economics is. It's not something like concrete, like, let's call it demand side, right? If you wanted to understand the Green New Deal, it's best understood as the government spends robustly, and when the government spends robustly and creates jobs, those jobs create demand in the market, which then redistributes and circles wealth and moves it through economic systems that otherwise it doesn't go through because it tends to aggregate all into Wall Street. That's my summary of it. And you're not going to get my summary from a lot of other people. You might get something close, but it's not going to be as tight as supply side. But that's a more concrete theory of economics than anything the Democratic leadership has been putting out. What's Joe Biden's theory of economics? Listen up, Jack. I don't know. What's Harris's? And I think that's certainly a frustration for people. If you look at Pew polling and you see that people care about the economy, one of the ways that you would create trust and kind of bridge the trust gap there is by saying, I've got a plan for the economy. I have a plan for that. There was a candidate who was doing stuff like that, but that person's not the nominee. And otherwise, now you just kind of have this gulf here going on. So if it was just about my worldview, other things I might say is, and this is actually, I think, kind of more backed up by empirics. So this is one that's different. I'm not hearing it mentioned a lot, which is that Democrats, liberals, the left, basically screwed when it came to ground game, and that there was an absolute absence of ground game from the Democratic Party but it was almost necessarily so. Why? Well, liberals, lefties, Democrats, they actually understand that the coronavirus is a thing. They've been wearing their masks. They support robust lockdowns. They do not want you to give them the coronavirus. And they're pretty sure that if you come to their house and knock on their door and open up their door, especially if you don't have a mask on, you might. So they don't want any door knocking. And this creates a real asymmetry in the campaign battlefield for Trump that Trump's team tried to exploit, and it seems that they exploited to some success because they did a lot of door knocking. And that type of door knocking, especially if the campaign is going to be waged along the contours of the Democrats are the more responsible party when it comes to the coronavirus, and that you can trust Democrats, left, liberals, the progressives more on the coronavirus. If the Democrats are going around and knocking on doors, it's deeply undermining to that argument that they actually get it. So necessarily so, you get this real asymmetry in how much door knocking you can do. And we were seeing things like the Trump campaign knocking. Alex Thompson was doing a lot of reporting on this, that like there was asymmetries in some states where the Trump people had knocked on 250,000 doors and the Biden campaign had knocked on 0. That was back in August. But certainly stuff like that is, revealing of a difference in strategy. I'm not saying the Biden people should have done it. And if it had been Sanders or Warren, and they had done it, it wouldn't have been any better. Because if you go around and you give everyone COVID, certainly, think about the way the media covers these things too. They would have been absolutely aghast and I never if the Democratic nominee or the Democratic campaign had been spreading COVID. And to their credit, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris did not get COVID during the course of this campaign. So, I think that's certainly a feather in their cap, but there was certainly a limitation too, right? If it was just about affirming my worldview, although again, this is another one where I think there's actually some evidence to support it, or at least kind of like a guiding logic that you can glean from this. I think the Democratic / liberal / left / progressive party gains absolutely nothing from being the party of old faces, particularly when those old faces are not just around the age of 80, but also people who have been in politics for 25, 30 years. It is very, very hard to be the party that is promising new ideas and change and a departure when you are not led by new faces. And so repeatedly going back to Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the House, how can you say that this party is really all that different from 10 years ago when they're still led by Nancy Pelosi? It's really hard. You have to make like these weird, look at all these down ballot candidates and look at all this diversity. But like the person who's doing the thinking and the shot calling at the top is fundamentally unchanged. And she is the daughter of a machine politician, Thomas D'Alessandro. And she's been in office for an unbelievably long time. And she has not faced a competitive race in an unbelievably long time. She's in a stronghold seat. She is protected. She is unchallenged. And she is unchanged. And she's almost 80. And it's really hard to be like, I'm cool, I'm hip, I'm 80. And I've got all the new ideas. And Chuck Schumer ain't exactly jazzing it up either. So I think it's important for the Democratic, left, liberal, progressive party, whatever you want to call it, to be led by new faces. And to that point, when did they have the greatest success and the most traction and really kind of the peak of their traction with the American electorate and the belief that this is a party of new ideas? It's when they nominated the new guy who came on the scene in 2004, delivered the kick-ass speech at the Democratic convention, and then that guy was the one who got tapped to be the nominee in 2008. People complain that he was hot-shotted, but I'd argue that maybe for the Democratic Party, it's important to go with the hot hand and not try to fight yesterday's war. So running an old candidate who has already lost, whether it's Joe Biden or even to a certain extent Bernie Sanders, I actually think it all ends up being a bit of a drag on the overall core messaging of the Blue Party, whoever the blue party is, which is we're the party of new faces and new ideas. And then we get into probably the darkest part of this, and the thing that I'm really struggling with, and a thing I've been warning about for a while. So if this was just going to be about my worldview, I'd bang the drum here and I'd say this with a little bit more confidence. But I think it's something that we're really seeing evidenced out here with the narrowness of the electoral results. The Democrats wouldn't have won this election, no matter who ran, but for the pandemic, because the Democrats, led by Nancy Pelosi, aided in no small part by the section of the left commentariat who regularly book and amplify and signal boost people like Glenn Greenwald, Michael Tracy, etc. for the last 4 years, did a lot of legwork to make sure that none of Trump's outrages mattered. And in cases of both of them, whether it's Pelosi or the left, it's always this idea that the thing that we're talking about today is a distraction from some big, deeper, more important issue that people really care about. And we need to just stop talking about this specific outrage, whether it's kids in cages and a child separation policy, or the fact that there is a direct line relationship between Donald Trump, Roger Stone, his associate of 30 plus years, Julian Assange, and the Russian government. That a direct line relationship was there, and we saw more portions of the Mueller report unsealed yesterday that only further flesh out the depth and the concrete nature of that relationship. Well, if you say everything from child separation to working with a foreign government to get your campaign over the finish line are all distractions, if you say that going and getting dirt on Hunter Biden is an abstract thing, it's not real, Trump's not really doing it, it's a distraction from the real issue. If you say everything's a distraction and nothing really matters, guess what? Because the voting electorate looks at, the political experts to figure out what matters, they assume that nothing matters. Because they get told by the voices that they trust, nothing matters. So, if you are part of these signal makers in these audiences, and you have been telling people that things don't matter, you are part of the problem. And that extends to Nancy Pelosi, it extends to people in the commentariat. Different people, different audiences, different levels of guilt. But yeah, if you're selling keep our powder dry, he's not worth it, or this is a distraction, yeah, you're part of the problem here. And these election results are on your head. So yeah, no, it's the Democrats for sure. They kept saying we need to keep our powder dry, and I'm not really clear when the powder was going to be fired. But I think there are other people who maybe could be held to account by that exact same standard for deciding that nothing really matters. This political brand of nihilism does not yield fruits that people want. And, oh, by the way, saying nothing matters and it's a distraction from the real issue is really counterproductive if you don't sell people on what the real issue is and you don't gain traction with the real issue, whatever that is. But I will say this, failure. It happened last night, and failure should be punished. So, first and foremost, Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership, especially in down ballot races, really failed here. And there was a real failure of money mobilization, and some of that definitely is at the doorstep of the Democratic Party. But sticking on that money mobilization theme, there has been a real failure of targeted money mobilization in down ballot races, and it's not just exclusive to the Democratic leadership. I think too often, activists like the sexy inside straight draw, to use a poker term. This is a kind of hard to get poker hand in either 5-card or Texas Hold'em. It's unlikely, but there's this allure about pulling out the inside straight that, if I get a 6, I'm going to win this thing outright. I'm going to, hit the long ball, essentially. Hey, to mix my metaphors here, baseball and poker. There's a real fondness for the long ball when I think that especially when it comes to activist politics. There needs to be much more appreciation for the blooping single, maybe the occasional double, even just getting a walk on base. Just worry about the OPS stats, people, if we're going to keep it in baseball metaphors here. Stop worrying about hitting the long ball, because what happens is presidential campaigns get a ton of money dumped into them, and there are a lot of down ballot races that need serious fundraising. And you were seeing a little bit of this, and the Democrats kind of tipping their hand that they knew that this was a problem when you saw people like Brian Schatz and Chris Murphy and other people doing a raise money for the down ballot challenge and stuff on Twitter. I think they realize that they have a deeper down ballot problem here. So I'm hopeful that there's some learning, but activists need to be a little more thoughtful on this too. We need to pick good down ballot candidates. We need to get our money behind them and stop worrying so much about getting our good person in the White House and hoping that all change is going to come from the White House. If anything, the Trump presidency should be pretty instructive in the limitations of that White House-driven strategy and the need to have support for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Glad she won re-election last night. She is one person, and her formula is really tricky to replicate elsewhere because you don't have the Democratic Socialists of America operating in a blue stronghold district in New York City where they have a real history of running. You're going to need a different formula if you're going to get more help for AOC nationwide here. And I think it's important that people and activists think about what that formula is. Polling, however, is another place where I think a lot of failure needs to be punished. We have seen a steady string of polling, and people want to trust polling experts. Why? I mean, I want to trust polling experts. I'm not immune to this, but my logic's really simple. These are people who make money, I assume, by doing polls, generating polls for news organizations and for political campaigns. And if for some reason they generate polls that are garbage, they're not going to have a meal ticket anymore. So if you want to keep working in electoral politics, it behooves one to come up with polls that don't suck. That does not appear to have happened. So that failure needs to be punished. And I think one of the ripple effects of this election and a big loser of this election is going to be polling. And people, no longer just the right now, are going to be deeply skeptical about polling when it comes to states and what was wrong about these polls and what went wrong here. Some of it I really do believe goes back to the basic inability of the Democrats to run a ground game. And I'm not saying like a lack of competency. I'm saying, as I was discussing a little earlier in the video, more or less a political unreality for them to run a ground game of any sort here. And then last, and I think that this is the tricky part and why I opened up and saying this is not about a validation of my worldview. And I think when we do the full episode of Don't Worry About the Government, which you can find on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify, we'll get into this a little bit deeper here. I really struggle with this last one. This like hurts my soul. Because I am someone who thinks about issues and sees these discrete events in the news and thinks about my worldview, my libertarian-inspired liberalism, whatever it is. I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about the name of the thing so much as I think about the thing in and of itself and these guiding ethos that rattle around in my head. I really struggle with this because I think that there should be a unified field theory, especially when it comes to politics and economics. Maybe social stuff can be a little bit more complicated, or the intersection of social stuff, politics, and economics, is different and interesting. But I try to get it all into this unified thing. And what I struggle with, because it would be agony for me, but what I have come to accept is not agony for others, is that there are people walking around this country. You probably work with some of them. You're probably going to go and see someone. They might be your boss, who go through their day-to-day with absolutely no sense of ideology. That they see one thing, they see another thing, they like this, They like that. They don't think about how this thing interacts with this thing. Doesn't matter to them. They like Trump. They like the fight for 15 minimum wage. That's a weird example, Chris. Yeah, but there's a bunch of people in Florida who did that last night. And I don't know how you message to them. I don't think it's a question of persuading them. If they don't know that the blue party is the minimum wage party and the red party is the business party at this point, I don't know how you sell it to them. I think that message has been pretty clear. If anything, Sanders' candidacy and his alignment with the blue party has only made that messaging clearer. If people aren't seeing it at this point, I would posit that maybe perhaps the issue is with the people and not necessarily the messaging, because the messaging's really, really clear on this one. And maybe people just like fancying a version of politics in America that doesn't quite exist. That they've been sold a narrative, in no small part, I would say from TV, but also like they fictionalize it in their head. And this is why I opened up with saying it's not about a worldview and it's not about affirming a political LARP, especially if it fits into your brand. There are people who have the fantasy that, if we have a divided Congress, like you have a Democratic House and a Republican Senate, that the best and most bipartisan and cool stuff will happen. And it's a fantasy based on this idea that Bob and Sally can get together and compromise and hold hands if we put them in a room long enough, and they'll see that maybe we're not so different. But it's not actually the way American politics works. And it's unfortunate that those people have been sold that fiction. And then the last thing I think about is that maybe there's an appeal to the Republican brand that is much stronger than we realized. And certainly when it comes to white demographics, it's easy enough to speculate as to what that appeal is. But there are other sections of the electorate, like, for example, Latinos, that broke for Trump. And I think some thought needs to be put into what the allure is there. And is there a way for progressive ideology to really speak to that when Donald Trump ran up building a wall to keep sections of their family out of the country? I don't know, man. I just don't think that, especially at 9 p.m. on election night, you can make sweeping thoughts on that or sweeping statements on that. I don't even know that I can make sweeping statements on that right now, but it is certainly a trend line that we're seeing developed. And it's certainly something that I'll be exploring on the next episode of Don't Worry About the Government. So go over and subscribe to Don't Worry About the Government. Make sure you get the new episode. You'll be able to see the video version of it at patreon.com/DWATG. And how about this? We're going to end these shows here with a album recommendation. An album recommendation? A album recommendation. Embarrassing. An album recommendation. Go and listen to Fugazi's End Hits. Have a good day.